All right, so a lot of reaction from that and a lot of rhetoric over the last week. But let's help you understand just how this figure came about and what this report is indeed all about. Let's start with a very clear understanding of the Office of the Auditor General. It's an independent office. It's under Article 248 of the Constitution, and the appointment of the holder of that office is done in accordance with Article 229. Now, the role of this office is to audit national government ministries, departments, agencies, funds, and even projects that are funded by development partners. Now, they did their audit for the financial year ended June 30th, 2014, during which 1.2 trillion shillings was spent. Now, a third of that is what is being questioned by the Auditor General. Now, let's look at some of the highlights of this report, in which the Auditor General termed as disturbing problems in the government's accounting system. So we'll just go through the highlights and then we'll delve into some of those in a bit of detail in just a few minutes. So this is the figure here, 67 billion shillings that was unaccounted for by 17 government departments. Here's another thing. You've heard of the figure of 26% coming up, only out of that was found to have had a clean approval. Now, they audited 101 financial statements and only 26 out of those had a clean audit opinion. Now, a clean audit opinion is generally where the financial statements provided give a true and fair view in all material respects. Here's something else. 10 government departments failed to pay their bills amounting to 17 billion shillings, and these are like sports and culture, agriculture, and the judiciary, although they say they have forwarded those payments to this financial year. Another thing that raised eyebrows from the Auditor General's report was the empty office spaces that were paid for by the National Police Service Commission, and we'll be getting to some of the responses from the Treasury in just a moment. Here's something else. 32 faulty armored vehicles for the military. About 1.1 billion shillings was spent for this. Auditor General says he fails to see whether there was value for money in the acquisition of these vehicles. Now, here's a big one. 2 billion shillings transferred to an offshore account according to the Auditor General's report. What is this 2 billion shillings for? Let's get into some detail with that one. Now, this was for that sovereign bond that was floated last year. Now, on the 24th of June 2014, this is the amount of money. They're mind-boggling figures, so, just bear with us for a moment. It's about $1.99 billion. That's about $2 billion. Now, the government received these from the sovereign bond, and it was deposited in an offshore account. This is what is worrying, because it was contrary to Article 206 and Section 17 of the Public Finance Management Act of 2012, and that act states that all monies that are received by the government or on behalf of the government should be deposited in the consolidated fund. Why was the Auditor General concerned with this? It's because if it's not in the consolidated fund, then the money can be appropriated without the authority of the controller of budget and could also be spent for purposes other than what the sovereign bond was floated for. So let's get into some of these figures, right? The ministries and departments. You've heard of that 67 billion shilling figure from 17 government departments or ministries. Now, these are the amounts of money that they said they could not account for. They have no documents. The lowest amount you will see here is from the Commission for Implementation of the Commission, which failed to account for how it spent just 9,200 shillings. The figures get bigger and bigger as we go. The Ministry of Agriculture at 1.2 billion, Defense at 74 million shillings. I want to draw your attention to Ministry of Education here at 12 billion shillings, and if we move on to the next one, you'll see a couple of other figures that are cause for concern. The Ministry of Environment was at a 15.9 million. Here's something. Ministry of Health failed, according to the Auditor General, failed to account for 22.5 billion shillings. Also a similar figure from the Ministry of Transport, 22.05 billion shillings. Here's the National Police Service Commission failing to account for 59 million shillings. And it goes on. The Attorney General's Office and the Department of Justice, there are 2.7 billion. Now this one, there was a specific response from the National Treasury on this one, and we'll get to that in a moment. And you can see some of the others there, the Teacher Service Commission, Judiciary, and the National Humanitarian Fund. That total figure comes to the figure you've been hearing over the last week, about 67 billion shillings. Now, What is peculiar about this is that some of the ministries that were mentioned in this report were given clearance certificates by the Auditor General, something that would require some explanation from him. And at this point, we should say we invited the Auditor General. He was not available to answer to some of these queries. Now, why that 67 billion shilling figure is causing a bit of concern, according to economists, is that it is twice the amount of money that was lost during the Goldenberg scandal. That was about 37.4 billion shillings, and we know the far-reaching effects that had on the economy over time. Here is the National Treasury response that was released late last week. This is what they said. No resources were lost. In fact, they go on to say that some of those ministries, in fact few of them, were not able to supply the documents, but that those documents are available. They were given to the Auditor General's office, but that they were not taken into account by the time he was putting together the final report and submitting that to the National Assembly. They also criticized the Office of the Auditor General for not holding a final audit review meeting, and this is as per international standards of auditing. Now let's get into some of the specifics they raised about that. Now you remember the figure of 2.7 billion shillings we showed you just a few short moments ago that they said they were unable to account for. That's the Attorney General and the Department of Justice. National Treasury saying they're disputing that fact, and this is what they're saying. Now they in fact say this figure does not add up because for the financial year 2013-2014 the entire budget for the Attorney General's office was 3.3 billion shillings. They've given a breakdown as to how that was used. 1 billion shillings for personnel emoluments, salaries, and 1.2 billion shillings was transferred to state corporations. So they say do this math, then this figure of failing to account for 2.7 billion shillings does not add up. Let's take a look at another one. The Ministry of Health. They again disputed that figure of 22.5 billion shillings unaccounted for. They say surely there was an agreement that was entered into by the national and county governments to assist the county governments pay salaries for the first half of the year, that's 2013-2014, and they say this agreement was made with the full knowledge of the Controller of Budget, the Commission for Revenue Allocation, the Transition Authority, and indeed also the Office of the Auditor General. They say all of them were aware of this arrangement. Documentation exists to prove that. And another figure that came up, remember when we talked about the empty offices for which rent was paid, and there was apparently no rental agreement between the National Police Service and the owners of that building? They say that figure was in fact not 31 million shillings, but it was 24.4 million shillings, and they say documents were provided to the Office of the Auditor General. Finally, another figure that came out that the National Treasury is disputing, that is from the Agriculture Ministry, that's Agriculture, Livestock and Fisheries. 1.28 billion shillings documents were availed for that. So this is where we find ourselves now. Is this the scandal that never was? That is the question we're asking you today. So please send in your feedback at KTN News, at Yvonne Okwara. Also on SMS, the number is 22155, and let us know what your thoughts are on this on Checkpoint. We have Johnson Sakaja, who's the chair of the National Alliance Party. We also have Kwame Owino, and we have Karithi Murimi, Nicholas Gumbo. If you've heard about the troubles that have been bedeviling our local airline, stuck in Kisumu with a delayed flight, we hope we will make it in on time. But keep your views coming in.